Boo! I've been working on that all week. You have no idea. You have no idea. So, first of all, I think we want to thank Warehouse 21 for giving us a space to be able to make this conversation happen. So let's... Until you've organized an event where you say that you want to go someplace and you want to have a discussion about race, you wouldn't believe how difficult it is to find space to have a conversation about race. We're not going to say any names about places where we tried to organize this, but we thank Anna and Warehouse 21 folks for welcoming us with open arms. I also want to thank the organizers, and we'll be able to thank them later more formally, but I do want to thank Alexis, I want to thank Ivy, I want to thank Noah for really having the industrial spirit and say that it's time to have this conversation in light of recent events. And I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel. We were lucky enough to have such a positive response to the list of people that we invited today, an overwhelming response really, and I'll let you know now that this is just the first of many discussions. There's a second list of speakers that we just had to figure out how to keep it manageable for tonight to get the 8 people that we had today, but there's a whole 2 or 3 more discussions worth of experts, and when we say experts, we don't necessarily just mean by book, we also mean by like lived experience, and so there's like 2 more separate discussion panels of experts that we could have and we will have in addition to tonight. But we thank you all for being here today and taking time out of your schedule for an important conversation that ideally is ongoing. But it seems like the conversation always goes away until the next thing happens. And so we're trying to be proactive. We're trying to turn what might be a negative or a blemish, if you will, on the PR of Santa Fe into a positive in the reality of Santa Fe. Yes. So contextually, I don't know where everybody's at in the room. Contextually, we're not going to begin at necessarily systemic institutional racism 101. You have a handy dandy zine right in your hand if you need cliff notes to tonight's discussion. Also in that zine, because we don't want to make this necessarily about us and necessarily our positions. We don't want to necessarily make this about, we don't want to necessarily advertise to you the work we do, but some people, like the people on this panel, do this kind of discourse, this kind of community building, this kind of community healing work for a living. Their bios are in your pamphlet as well. If you would like to find out more about them, you can definitely look them up through the interwebs, through the internet. But we're not going to spend 30 minutes necessarily in introductions. We're actually going to dive right in. And so my last piece before I get out of your way and let them kind of have the conversation is to give you a little bit of context. Oh, sorry, a little bit of housekeeping first. Come and go as you need to. Take care of yourselves. Bathrooms are around the corner to the left. We will have a space at the end of the panel to answer questions. The way we're going to do that tonight, how we're going to facilitate that so that we don't get folks that really love microphones, like me, dominating the discussion and asking all the questions. But we want to honor the sincerity and the genuineness of your questions. And so there will be people walking around the room with note cards. And if you have a question, just raise your hand. They'll come bring you a note card. You write it down. You send it back to them. It'll also be a way for us to economize our time at the end of the night so we don't have people necessarily asking multiple questions. And so what we'll do is take your questions and try to synthesize them into themes. Okay, and if you want more and you feel like your question is very unique, there'll be a space for that where we're actually collecting stories, and it's the beginning of a storytelling project that I'll talk more about at the end of the panel so that you could have more personal time to kind of talk about your experience as well. And there'll be ways to interact with the organizers as well as the panelists offline after the panel as well. But we really want to honor everybody's time, and we really want to make sure that that we're kind of leveling the power in the room by making sure that we kind of manage the whole question Q&A process. So, first things first, the reason we are not here tonight is necessarily to talk about Dave Chappelle and Christian Englander, right? Though that particular incident did spike a conversation that was or wasn't being had in Santa Fe. And so the main feedback that we were getting, and the organizers can speak to this too a little bit later, when in the organizing of the event, in talking to the press, trying to promote the event, was this, how could this happen in Santa Fe kind of spirit? And if the question you have is how could this happen in Santa Fe, then you've missed you've missed the things that have been happening all along. You've missed the microaggressions, and maybe it's because of your privilege, or maybe because it's easier just to not talk about it. But for whatever reason, this is not an isolated event. If you're not as famous as Dave Chappelle, this incident does not end up in the Times magazine. It doesn't end up on New York Times website page, right? And so we wanted to begin the discussion today in talking about systemic racism, and not particularly about that event, though that event is an opportunity to teach, it's an opportunity to learn, it's an opportunity to be here today and really inspire us to have this conversation, and hopefully keep it going and not need incidents like these to keep occurring in a sleepy town like Santa Fe, that we would actually just wake up and stay awake. And that would be kind of the way that we function and we operate. And so, incident versus systemic, and this is just the metaphor that I came up with and might not be a good one, the panelists will correct me if I'm wrong, is that think about the situation with Christian and Dave, and think about if the roles were reversed, not to play on this whole black-white binary, because we know racism, systemic racism is much more complicated than black and white, but that's normally how it gets framed. Think about if the roles were reversed. Would the outcome have been the same? And when we say, would the outcome have been the same, we say, well, of course it wouldn't have, because they wouldn't have racialized it if it was a black guy throwing a banana peel at a white comedian. Well, first of all, they would have kicked him out of the Lensic in a much different way if it was a black guy throwing a banana peel at a white comedian. And second of all, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. There would have been no context necessarily for a banana peel, especially in the loaded kind of racial undertones that come with that. And it would have been not necessarily an assault. It would have been something that just happens in comedy, and comedians pick on the audience, and the audience throw things at the crowd, and it would not even enter our social imagination as something that could be racialized. And so rather than bear the burden as people of color to say, oh, you racialize everything, let's imagine if the roles were different, it wouldn't even have the opportunity to be racialized, which is in effect an outcome and part of systemic racism. So we want to kind of get beyond that tonight. We want to talk about not Dave Chappelle and Christian Englander as fish, but we want to talk about the water that they're swimming in. And the water that they're swimming in is problematic. That's the world we live in. That's what we can change moving forward. We can talk about what happened till we're blue in the face, but where we want to end this discussion is giving you guys real tools, real resources, things that already exist that you may not know about, things that these people are involved in that they can point you towards, data we want to point, and we want to organize and actually do things so we can make sure that we actually change the ecosystem and not just point at a few bad fish. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel here. I am going to have the panel just go down and do names, because though you have their bios in front of you, we need you to match their faces to their names. And so each panelist, if you would just go make sure our mics work and go down, we'll start with you, Brian.
Good evening, my name is Brian Hargrove. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening, my name is Kiran Katira. Thanks.
Good evening, my name is Tanya Covington.
Buenos tardes, le de Dios. My name is Patricia Trujillo.
Hello, I'm Daryl Lorenzo Wellington.
I'm Michael Santianes.
Hello, I'm Karen Rencounter.
Hi, I'm Ivy Rizzo.
Let's have a round of applause for all our panelists. I'm asking you to clap for them now, because after they say some uncomfortable things, you might not want to clap for them. So panelists, that's that at the end too. That we just move that at the end as well. So we want to jump right in, panelists. We've kind of already discussed the arc of this conversation in talking about context. And so, like I said in the beginning, this is not isolated to the Chappelle Englander incident, but what have we seen in Santa Fe over the years? Some of our panelists are from Albuquerque, so what have we seen in central New Mexico over the years that lets us know that this is not a unique conversation? So who wants first? If no one jumps, I'm just going to call you. There you go, Michael.
Just want to talk a little bit about the history of Santa Fe, and I don't know it that well, but I know that there's a history of a lot of different cultures and races coming together, and it hasn't always been peaceful. In fact, there's a lot of bloodshed that was, that occurred here, and that kind of thing doesn't just go away. In fact, it feeds the present, and I think we need to work together to kind of come to some resolutions and deal with some of that pain, and there's generational pain. Santa Fe in New Mexico is not the most diverse place I've been. There's a few dominant ethnicities, and if you don't fit into any one of them cleanly, people don't really know what to make of you or kind of how to treat you. You have Native Americans have been here the longest, and you have the coming of the Chicanos and the Spanish, I guess, who then gave birth to the Chicanos along with the natives, and then the Anglos came in the pioneer days along with other races, and people are still trickling in. I think we need to all really treat each other with more sensitivity and realize that, my opinion is, we're all people, and we need to be able to connect on that level. And then everything else is like the spice of life, is what makes things interesting. But let me say one more thing. I've seen it go all kinds of ways. I've had people, I'm mixed race. My dad's Chicano, my mom's white, and people that's not cleanly into any category. Growing up, they would call me coyote, which is mestizo. And I think we're all, if you really start looking at our history, we're all mestizo in some form or other. And I think that goes a long way if we realize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Darryl?
Sure. I'll address this if you ask, I think, the question about racism in Santa Fe. I've lived here about 6 years, and it is a city of diversity. That's truth to that, but there's an undercurrent of racial tension, I have always felt, and still do. Just to give a brief rundown, once again, it's hard to say anything without risking offending someone. So let me make clear, the majority of people of all the groups I'm about to name have never said such things that I'm about to say, but enough people have said them for them not to be merely coincidental. First one would be something, say, from a white person expressing the feeling that they're actually a minority here, that they're abused by Hispanics, that something along the lines of, if my name were Gonzalez, I would make money in Santa Fe. Okay, the second one is something from, say, Hispanic. I've off more than a few times heard, literally, I don't like Anglo. Now let me make clear, when you talk to them deeply, they can come out some real reasons for this. For instance, I don't like land grants, I don't like certain historical things, that's not bigotry. Those are real statements of honest grievances. It's just when it devolves to I don't like Anglos, that's when it's, that can be characterized as bigotry. The final one, as an African American, then I'll move on. This is the most offensive one to me, and it happens a lot here. I mean, more than a few times. It's people who are very free and very cavalier with referring to all African Americans by a racist epitaph that begins with an N.
Thank you, Darryl. Who wants to jump in? I'll jump you in. Ivy, go for it.
So I'm white, and recently I've been hearing from other white people the question of, why is this happening now, and kind of this idea that it's new. So my question is, why does this feel new to so many white people? And I think that in white culture we have this kind of 1-2 punch of deny and then edit. And what we do is we take Black and brown people's stories of pain and we immediately don't believe them. And we, we derail, we justify, we excuse. And then, the second part of that 1-2 punch is to edit, to take over the narrative, to take over their story and take control of it and say, no, actually you're wrong, that's not really what happened. And that 1-2 punch silences and it deletes it from white history, which is kind of what's taught in our school. It's what's provided by the 88% of journalists that are white. I wanted to talk about 1906 and Bronx. there was a, as recently as 1906, there was a black person in the zoo, and they were in the monkey house, and they were made to carry chimpanzees. And so for white people to say, well, I don't know the history of bananas and black people, we need to learn it. There's a reason why we don't know it. Look, we need to learn our culture and then know it and see that, in New York City, black leaders and clergymen stood up at that time and said, hey, this is wrong. And what happened was there was denial and then an editing of that story.
Thank you for that history. Tanya, yes.
It's always interesting to me when people say, why now, as if this is the first incident, because there has been racism in Santa Fe and in New Mexico for a very long time, and it takes a lot of different forms. And one of the forms is by having people say that we live in a tri-cultured state as opposed to a multicultured state, and leaving out my people, who history tells us were the second people to set foot on New Mexico land after the Native Americans and before the Spanish. We have been here since the 1400s, and yet we still don't count. That's racism, okay? So it has been going on for a very long time. Fast forward to what's going on and has been going on in the last couple of decades. Some of you might not know that there was big incidents and protests against the Cowgirl Cafe because they regularly used to do horrible racist things to any black person who dared come in there to eat. I was one of them who had some pretty horrible things done to them. We also had an incident where a black storyteller was invited to come and do storytelling at a church in Santa Fe. And there were people upset about that, so they actually wrote the word nigger on the side of a church. These things have been going on for a very long time. If you don't know about them, maybe there's a reason. Maybe you haven't wanted to know, but you need to know. Because the old saying goes, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
Thank you, Tanya. Karen?
I'm from Albuquerque, so the Santa Fe context from the Albuquerque perspective has a lot to do with the fact that there are a lot of well-meaning white people in Santa Fe, is how we see it, right? And what does that mean? And so what we have sort of seen in Albuquerque general is the whole sort of pervasive colorblindness that happens with people that want to see good in the world and are not willing to face what's real. And colorblindness in our era means that we want everyone to be just seen as, oh, we're all human, we should just all be one family, that I don't see your color, I don't see your difference. And I think that, and from my accent you can tell I'm definitely an outsider, 18 years in New Mexico though, right? 20 years in Europe. And what happens is I was jarred by how nice people are, but how systemic the racism is and how deep it is in our institutions and how we allow it because we don't want to have tricky conversations. We don't want to have truth told, and you don't want to go there, right? And so what I would say to all the well-meaning people, and I would say of all races, we need to do the work and go there. We need to learn our history. We need to learn each other's history, which sometimes takes a lot more effort. But I feel that this is one of the things that results in what goes on, and how those microaggressions that Tanya just mentioned have really deep impacts on people's health and well-being and psychological and social acceptance in any kind of community. So don't underestimate microaggressions, and know that well-meaning people do them all the time. So.
Thank you, Kenan. Dr. Castillo. Let me get Dr. Castillo, sorry. Brian, she had it first.
Oh,
And then I'm gonna come back to Brian.
I'm Trujillo, not Castillo.
What I want to say is initially. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I got you next.
This is just a really hard conversation to jump into because one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that regardless of our subjectivity, wherever we come from, we have some sort of privilege, right? So even sometimes when people are framed as coming from communities that are maybe economically impoverished, we have different kinds of things that we consider wealth in those communities, right? So I'm not from Santa Fe either, I'm from Española. My dad is from Taos, my mom is from El Huache. And we are definitely part of the group of people who identify as having long histories in New Mexico. But as a spatial theorist, as somebody who does cultural rhetoric, it's about understanding how all of these spaces can exist at the same time. So there is an author, Daniel Ariola, who talks about the construction of space as three things simultaneously, is that there are continuous spaces, discontinuous spaces, and emerging spaces, communities of people that are happening all the time. And so I really want to caution us from, this sense of ranking oppression, because the fact of the matter is that all oppression is interrelated. So as we talk about racism, we also have to talk about intersectionality of our other identities. Audre Lorde once said, there are no single issue movements because there are no single issue people. And so that sensibility that it's also about our gender identity, our sexuality, our class identity, whether we're rural or urban. For me, I see a lot of conflicts in the work that I do, being the fact that I identify as as a rural scholar in a very urban academy. And so those are like multiple ideas that we have to constantly juggle in regards to all of these different ideas about identity.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo. Brian. Trujillo, I'm sorry. I keep wanting to do that, I'm sorry.
My opening statement on this will be more observational, not necessarily revelatory to anyone, but as someone who's been fortunate enough to travel the world quite extensively for a long time, I think the absurdity of this is the shock that people seem to have, that would happen in Santa Fe. I believe that's absurd. I believe it's absurd that anybody would think that this wouldn't happen in Santa Fe, Santa Fe is a city with people in it. It's a city made up of communities, surrounded by larger communities. There are power structures here. There are power structures that make up everything, cities, states, nations. When those power structures are immovable in any particular way, you're going to have problems. If your power structure is established as we are this, you're going to have problems when someone seems to challenge that. So whether it's racism or economic advantage or disadvantage, I think the shock that people are saying they have about this happening in Santa Fe, I think any grown person, any person with a brain should be insulted by the shock. Not that Santa Fe is special, because it's not more special than any other place I've ever been. It's nice, but there are people here. There are people here. There are people here who are hateful. There are people here who are loving. There are jackasses, and everything in between. So the shock is the absurdity. Now we can talk about something more specific, but I think everyone would agree that the shock should be the absurdity.
Thank you, Brian. It's that post-racial America that we don't live in. That's like, this can't happen anymore because slavery was so long ago. Karen, I wanted you to jump in if you wanted to.
Hi, my name is Karen. I have a few things coming to mind here. I work here in Santa Fe. I'm originally from South Dakota, and I work with young people in Santa Fe. I work on the south side of town, and since I've been sitting here and since I've heard about the event, something that I can't shake from my head is that beautiful painting of what is Santa Fe, and I feel like we're talking about it to an extent, but I can't help but recognize that we're sitting at Warehouse 21, and not to offend the folks that have organized this meeting, but I can't help but wonder, would we all be in this room right now had we had this meeting on the south side? would we all engage in the conversation in the same way if we had this meeting on the South Side where our youth of color live, where a majority of our youth of color live? I think that's important to think about, to consider. And the complex relationship that we have as community members of Santa Fe is complex for a reason, and it's perpetuated again and again and again. Some of the experiences I've had working with young people, talking about racism and sexism, talking about what it means to be a transgender youth of color in our community, what it means to be a Native youth in our community. And the scariest thing to me is that it is heavily perpetuated that we are meant to be colorblind to be equal. And being colorblind means to erase me as a person, and I'm not willing to do that. And I ask the young folks I work with to never do that to themselves. It's dehumanizing, and it does not solve any of the issues. What I've been astounded by is how many young people do want to engage in these conversations and how many adults shove them right back out. So these are things that I'd like us to think about as we gather in this space. Grand example would be our incredible youth organizers from Capitol High School and Santa Fe High standing up against the park testing and the way they were treated by adults. And we didn't have a response to that as a community. I haven't seen adults show up for that conversation from organizations, nor our teachers have a gag order right now. So these are really relevant things that are happening in our community right now. And when we look at things like standardized testing and how it's pushing our youth of color out of the schools at a drastic rate, and essentially parting the sea like Moses in regards to who gets to go on to secondary education, these are the relevant issues as well in our community and what our community members are going through. So again, I ask, if we had this meeting on the South Side, would you all attend? Would you continue to be part of this conversation?
Thank you, Karen. Two important things you mentioned too, so when we talk about systemic racism, one of the high-level grade A tenets of systemic racism is geographic racism, right? It's loans, it's housing, it's the inability to own wealth or inability to own homes in certain places. So that geographic racism is part of systemic racism. It's easy to decry somebody who throws a banana at a black comedian. It's harder to go after your own neighborhood associations. It's harder to go to your roundhouse and say, how come black people, brown people, red people don't live in my neighborhood next door? So that's totally different. So we thank you for that, and thank you for giving us a current event like the park testing that is highly politicized and highly racialized. I'm a media justice person, so when you heard about the protests in Albuquerque, all you heard was about the students walking out and vandalizing at Capitol, and not the students doing the same thing at Santa Fe High. So that piece is a contemporary piece that is much harder to touch and point at, much less comfortable to go after, because there's so many sides to the argument, and to pretend that it's not about race and color. So I know, panelists, we want to go, now it's just open, so we kind of got you to hear a little bit from each panelist. I'm just going to open it up to you guys and let you talk amongst each other, and kind of move us to the second phase of the conversation around what nationally, what's the national context? We just talked about the local context. Dr. Trujillo, let's talk about the national context. Or make a comment on what you heard.
I was going to say, I just wanted to piggyback off of the last comment in terms of thinking also about, for me, when I first heard about this panel and found out that it was about, this man who had thrown this banana, I wasn't really interested in addressing this as an individual act. And what it really made me also reflect on is how do we talk about white dominance in Santa Fe? And so for one, speaking of a personal experience that's very painful to me, and it's about this simultaneity of spaces, is I love the Lensic. I love their programming. I love that they bring world-renowned thinkers and speakers to come to us. But if you have ever experienced the audience as a person of color at the Lensic Theater, it is really uncomfortable. There's usually maybe 2-3 dozen of us in an audience that's predominantly white. And the questions that I was asking myself and that I get emotional about is I work in Española, and it's like, how can we have Nobel laureates in Santa Fe and not make some kind of invitation? How do we not extend ourselves and say, hey, Española High School, Alice Walker's going to be at the Lensic Theater. And even those of us who are in the know, who do have invitations, we find out a week or two before the event because there's extra tickets. right? And so there's this sensibility of how do we start to address that kind of systemic racism as it's associated to youth and to education. And it's not about either or, right? It's not about like, stop doing this, Lenzik. It's about, Lenzik, how do you do what you're already doing wonderfully, but then share and extend that to other communities?
I'd like to say something on that, because I am one of the people who has called the Lenzik Theater, as well as called the Lannan Foundation, and asked directly, why are you doing this? Why is it that you bring in black scholars, yet you refuse to advertise in Albuquerque, where there's far more black people who live than in Santa Fe? And what they told me was, we don't need to. We're about filling seats. And so we advertise only in Santa Fe because we know there are people in Santa Fe with money and they will pay to come. And we really don't, and they were quite blatant in saying, we really don't care whether or not you all show up. And I feel like until more people in Santa Fe know that, and the white people in Santa Fe who do show up start asking those questions, it means nothing to them hearing it from me. Absolutely nothing.
Let me say this about that. I make all of my statements from a two-sided position, because without both sides or all sides, because like you said earlier, it gets framed as black and white, which means it's two. But unless it's looked at from all sides, we're only going to continue to go around and around in a circle. The power structure of the country is a white-dominated power structure. Okay, it's gonna be something. Okay, there's power structures everywhere. It's always something. You look at the Lenzik Theater. If the Lenzik Theater says, well, we don't have to, that's actually a good enough answer. You know why? Because they don't really give a shit about anything but selling those seats. I think an overarching desire to be in that room with all of those other people if you're not welcome, that strong desire to be there will keep you in a situation where, well, we're going to keep you out and they're just going to be unhappy. There has to, and your story is valid, and the truth of it is clear. The resolution is not going to come by people in a position of power saying, okay, we'll give you a little bit of grace. Because that's all we're really talking about. Why is that all we're really talking about? Because if the power structure is of a certain people, then law enforcement is going to be of a certain people, generally, or the ones that really call the shots. I'm just going right to the bone of this. So if you don't fit where they want you to fit, then you've got to get on your knees and say, well, can you be nice and give us this? Give us that. One of the biggest blind spots that people have are where people of color do dominate, and when they give up power. Who are the dominant players in basketball? Who are the dominant players in football? There's no unity there to break the dominance of ownership and or control. There's not enough unity there. There's reasons for it. I'm not saying that none of this is valid. I am saying the conversation must be had standing up, looking eye to eye, not on your knees. That's all I'm saying.
Down there, I think we moved it closer to you.
Oh, I can go?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is my fault. Yes, thank you.
Oh, I don't know if this is piggybacking or not. I just wanted to give some impression. Obviously, what was said about audiences in Santa Fe, you all know this is true. They tend to be very segregated. I remember when I first came to Santa Fe, being an outsider, I was actually surprised when the Native Americans are all lined up in front of the plaza. I know now that's intentional, but just the image to me, like there was this line drawn. And in some ways, that still is Santa Fe. that there's a real hesitancy to speak about things, perhaps out of great fear. Let's take, for example, something I'm almost afraid to mention. Let's say the fiesta. There are people who are offended by the fiesta, by certain elements. And by the way, let me emphasize here, I'm not saying it should end the fiesta, but I was shocked by that it hadn't progressed any. I mean, I'm from the South, and we have this with the Civil War. Huge thing. When I was young, they never mentioned slavery. Never. But my point is, there's been real progress, especially with movies like 12 Years a Slave. And so to make it more inclusive, and it really concerns me, not that they still have it, it's important to the community, but it hasn't changed. Nothing has been done to make it more inclusive. It's like, and this, perhaps this relates to how Santa Fe is a tourist city, where its image is related to being stuck in time, but you can only remain stuck in time for so long. History has to catch up with you eventually. It's just a fact. And I think what this results is a lot of internalized anger. Let me be generous. Even all this inwardishness, which I hear a lot of, I think the real source behind it is internalized anger. People cannot free to say what they're really upset about. And so it comes out in harsh speech and separatism. And this concerns me about Santa Fe and always has. But it can change.
Ivy and then Kiran.
So, I'm hearing from the other panelists quite a bit about racism and poverty, and we all know that being poor is really expensive. So white people, the median net worth households for white people is $142,000. For Hispanics, it's $14,000. And I use the word Hispanic because that's how we talk about race in these monetary numbers. For black people, it's $11,000. Okay, so we're talking like 10 times as much asset. Okay, how does that affect us? You know, how does that affect what we can do with our lives? How does that affect us systemically? When you look at the medical system, Hispanics receive 60% worse care than whites do. Blacks, it's 40% worse care. We look at the financial system, and again, you have these numbers that are just incredible. How the housing system, we have this history of redlining, not being, like Hakeem had mentioned, not being able to own homes, and then being sold bad bad loans and the foreclosure. We have the educational system where white students have much more access to AP courses. Like what other systems? Hiring systems. Black resumes with black sounding names on them, receive 50% less callbacks than white sounding names, even when that resume is exactly the same. So it really is systemic. And if you look at all of those systems, how do those systems affect your asset cachet? How do we get to white people having 142,000? Those numbers, right? That asset cachet also gets set back by policies. So you look at slavery, genocide, and then the policies that come down through the years, people of color's Wall Street's being systemically destroyed. As they build up economy, we take it away. And when I say we, I'm talking about white people.
Kiran, Michael, did you want to hop in after Kiran?
Sure.
Okay. Before I give it to Kiran, this is just the poet in me saying, with systemic racism, usually on one side you have people who are fearing for their lifestyle, and on the other side you have people who are fearing for their life. That's the middle of the road right there.
I love that, right? So, and in between you have gatekeepers, right? So I'm going to get to some of those gatekeepers. So why is it and how is it that we have institutional racism? This is a perfect segue from what Ivy just said, right? So we have all of that going on, and we live in a majority-minority state, right? So how is that going on? And how do institutions really perpetuate that sort of power differential, whether it's the achievement gap in education or the wealth gap or the health gap that we have to access health? How is that happening? How are we all part of it? Every single person in this room, right, including all of us panelists and everyone, are gatekeepers. We all have that relative power, right, in institutions, and we allow for things to happen. So it happens when it's through the media, like what stories are told and how they're told, what kind of media we buy, what kind of media we watch, what kind of media we fund. So all of the different institutions that Ivy mentioned have people within them that can make institutional change. So we need more organizing and more of us to actually help unpack what's going on, first of all, and then take some action to do it. And I think one of the hardest things for us to face is some of that internalized racial oppression that happens amongst us as well, right? Where we're all part of what's going on. But I would say that the biggest piece, tagging on to what David was saying about power, which is key for institutional racism, is interest convergence. And that's a term that sort of gets at how power will allow for things to happen as long as it's not dismantled. So it's going to yes certain things, it's going to allow for this, allow for that. Oh, a token black person in city council, or let's have someone who's a movie star that's black, and let's give him an Academy Award, or let's have that movie, 12 Years a Slave. Let's do all of these token things that pacify the population and give some sense of, well, there's progress, we're making these kinds of little inroads. That's power doing its job really well, and we're all buying into it. So, David?
Michael.
Yes, thanks. I do want to echo something that was said earlier, and that's the next one of these should be on the South Side. I think that's an important step. The other thing I do want to talk about is stopping the school-to-prison pipeline. There's too many young people failed by the systems that exist in this town and in northern New Mexico in general. There needs to be more alternatives to help people, and we need to erase the labels that get put on young children. I've met so many brilliant young people that came through the doors at YouthWorks who had so many doors slammed in their face, and these young people, all they needed to do is to be met with care and compassion and someone to take the time and show them, and not just throw them in an algebra class, but take the time and make sure they understand fractions, make sure they know their times tables. It's meeting each individual person, and we need to stop demonizing people by the way they look, by the way they dress, by the fact they got tattoos and baggy clothes. That doesn't mean they're scary people. The color of their skin, all these things combined, and it does happen on a daily basis. And I think it's true. There is historic racism, and we're born into this world, and it is our job to dismantle it, to celebrate our differences, and come together and give each other a chance. But especially for the youth, I know so many people from the time they're in 4th grade, they were labeled as bad kids, and they tend to be on South Side schools. And those schools are overflowing, while the East Side schools are nice and small. My idea is, how do we extend that privilege to all our youth? How do we extend those opportunities to all our youth? Thank you.
And thank you to Michael for connecting it back to the colorblindness comment, right? When we don't value different ways of learning, so we come from different ethnicities and different cultural heritages where, without pointing at standardized tests, right? Yeah. Where if you learn visually, it's different than if you learn linearly, if you learn through language, if you actually learn through music. And if we're colorblind, we think that all students should be able to pass the same tests. We think that everybody's experience is the same, as opposed to valuing the differences and figuring out a way to document that, a way to qualify that, a way to quantify that, to where one's experience is not privileged over another, right? So that's systemic racism right there. If we don't value the differences, we're actually doing our students, our young people, our adults, a disservice as opposed to saying that everybody does things the same way, because that's just frankly not true, right? Like Mr. Hargrove was saying, it's like, that's ridiculous.
And let me just backtrack on that. What you said is very valuable, but what we need to know is that when we decide that everybody is the same, the standard we use for sameness is whiteness. Okay, there is a reason why people of color have problems with standardized tests, because they were designed for white kids who come from a very different areas, different learning styles, different modalities. And it's the same thing with color blindness. When people say, oh, I don't see color, what they say is, I'm trying to pretend that you're white. And I feel like you don't understand, that does a major disservice to me, okay? I am not white, I will never be white, I don't want to be white. And if you can't see me for who and what I am, then you're rendering me invisible, which is also another horrible aggression. So we need to be really careful about that, because I still, to this day, hear people say, oh, well, you know, I'm teaching my kids to be colorblind. No, you're teaching your kids to be stupid, okay? Because no one is colorblind. We all can see each other's skin. You have more skin than you have anything else. And scientists tell us from the age of 2 years old, kids recognize when someone's skin is different from theirs. They don't necessarily make a judgment unless they've been taught, but they certainly recognize whether somebody's skin is the same of theirs or not. So why start off by teaching children a lie, especially when it's a lie that does not serve them well?
Dr. Trujillo?
I really want to echo what was just said. One of the first things that I was told when I started a position as a young professor, as a young woman of color, and to understand that in the United States, 0.02% of professors are Chicanas, right? So not even 1%, 0.02%. Or am I getting that wrong? My math is bad. But the fact of the matter is, one of the first things I was told is that I was to understand that my colleagues didn't necessarily see my Hispanicness as an asset. And so there was this real sense of just trying to say that whiteness is the modus operandi here, and as long as you don't rock that boat, you can fit in. And that's a message that, as a young scholar, I've been given over and over and over again, but also as a community member. And one of the things that I have trouble with, and I want us to consider as part of this conversation, is how we really pit community against things like educational institutions, when it's the institutionality of power that we need to be fighting. Institutions are the issue, but the other thing that's true, I come from a long line of educators, and there are people who have created safer spaces in schools so that people can thrive, so that students of color can have good opportunity. So I would really echo that sense that we should have meetings on the South Side, but I would also add to it that they should be multilingual, right? We should have Spanish translation, we should have Tewas translation, because this is not just a conversation that's happening in English.
And that becomes a gate. Gatekeepers were mentioned earlier, so language becomes a gate that's very firmly in place, and it looks just like the one at the south end of our state. So I want to just kind of take us to the stage 3 of the conversation, and then we want to open it up to you. Thank you all for still being here, because this is part of the work. Like, listening to this, especially if it's difficult for you to hear, is part of the work. So that's a little bit of bravery that you've exhibited by being here. So the last piece, so that we can leave with some things to do. It's like, okay, we understand that this Chappelle incident is not an isolated incident, that it fits very cleanly or uncleanly in the history of things as they've existed in Santa Fe for all 8 of these people, real life. They're not making it up. We have 8 corroborating witnesses here. There's a crime that's been perpetuated against the people of Santa Fe, and it persists. The criminal is still at large, and it's not Christian Englander, right? The criminal is us, some of us, right? And so what do we do next? How do we leave here and actually have some actionable things that we can begin doing to move this conversation forward? So we've asked the panelists kind of to talk about resources that they have access to, some of their own work even that could be useful to people in Santa Fe, and even some things that you've seen around the country that have worked.
Well, I'll go since mine is pretty vague. First, let me say I'm impressed. Thanks for having the best conversation about race I've heard in Santa Fe by virtue of being the only conversation race about. Well, what I'm getting here, and so this is vague, that's why I go first, is because of its multicultural nature, this is the worst place to talk about race less. That means you need to talk about it more. That's the main that may be the main fact that people have gotten backwards, that to preserve this peace, we don't talk about this, the opposite. You need to talk about it much more. I only know in my personal experience, whenever race comes up, and I've heard this literally many times, from many people something is said and they'll even say, oh, I'm sorry you heard that. Literally, I'm sorry you heard that. Not that it was wrong to say, but that I'm sorry. So if I hadn't been in the room, it would be okay to say that. That's not anti-racism at all. And challenging people is something people don't like to do here, but it's not challenging. It can be done in a way that's very informative, and we have shown that, I think. Now, my suggestions are very vague. I'll just add one thing. I remember when I wrote that article, Blacks in Santa Fe, it was almost intentionally on the part of our editor a way to talk about race without getting into the nitty-gritty hardcore stuff, because that was just, very risky material. But it's something that I think I can see we can risk. And I say we because I live here too, that we can risk, and I'll let other people speak.
Okay, so I'm very much for taking action on things, but from a place of knowledge. Some of the worst things we can do is just to act without some knowledge, education, reflection on action. One of the good ways to get a strong education is to learn from institutes like the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They're out of New Orleans. They're a phenomenal anti-racism group. If there are enough people in Santa Fe that can raise the funds, because they do cost, then sort of national trainers, to bring them in and do workshops. They've done that with police forces, they've done that with education institutions, they've done that with community members, and they are powerful. They help all of us, right, understand our work from a common lens. We need a common lens. If we right now try to ask you all to define racism, we'd have, 50 different definitions, right? So you can't undo something unless you know what it is. So we need some common language, some common lens, and we also need to do some self-reflection on our own roles as oppressors as well as oppressed, right? So people of color need to do some of that as well. There's a heck of a lot of theory behind some of these things, and then the practical application. I don't think we can just carry on theorizing unless we're immersed in communities of color and doing some kind of work with organizations that know what they're doing. So looking for cutting-edge organizations in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, wherever you live, to really try and apprentice with them, learn from them, be with them so that you get a reality check. You've got to be with the people, right? You can't just be at a distance. There are many things you can do around education as well, the curriculum. So if there's any of you there's probably loads of people that have experienced Rethinking Schools. It's a phenomenal resource. It's online. There's the Zinn Project as well. Howard Zinn has passed away, but there's a Zinn Project that really looks at the people's history of the United States and gives articles and lesson plans and all sorts of ideas for teachers. We need, I don't know how many people in this room have children. Go tell your teachers. How many of you are teachers? Go look that up, right? And start using it. These are just, the resources are out there. We need to tap into them. We need to practice them, use them. And then youth voice. One of my biggest passions is a hope in having the young people connected in all these conversations, having them take the lead, having them name what it is that needs to happen for institutional change, and then getting involved in institutional change efforts, right? So you don't have to be this savior of the world, right? Thinking you can make institutional change all by yourself. Even though our society is full of rewarding individualism and a heck of a lot of competition, don't do it. Try and be a part of something that's big, right? So you might join Families United for Education in Albuquerque. You might join a collective movement, whether it's Black Lives Matter, right? You're involved in something that's bigger and more powerful for getting institutional change to happen. And on our campus, there's a whole bunch of things that happen at University of New Mexico as well. So however you get involved, do it with others, definitely mobilizing, organizing with others. Don't think you have to take the lead. I think this is such an American disease, you know, so we need to learn how to be followers and team players and group members. And so I would recommend all of those things.
I'm gonna go down to Karen and then I'll come back this way to you, Tanya.
Hello. So some of us are going to walk out of this room and say that we came to this event. Some of us are going to walk out of this room and meet up with others and talk about this behind closed doors. Some of us are going to leave this room and continue this conversation in the open because it's safe for us. Some of us that are here aren't allowed to talk about this at all. And I think that is something to remember. We have 750 plus nonprofits in Santa Fe. Many of those nonprofits include the word social justice, racial justice, environmental justice in their mission statements. 750 nonprofits. Some of you are here, you might say, we went to that, this is the work that we're doing, but I'm going to ask you to find the courage to really make this work come alive in the work that you're doing in the community. That's a lot of organizations to include that kind of language and us still not see a difference here. Things like fiestas are a problem. That's an issue. Things like Native folks sitting on blankets on the floor for somebody else's entertainment, and that's called beautiful, that's an issue. Those are real issues in Santa Fe. So I'm going to ask you, the folks in the audience, to continue this conversation when you walk out the door and hold the nonprofits here accountable that use this kind of language in our mission statements.
Okay, so we're talking about action, my favorite subject. I think that the first thing, the first part of action is that you all showed up here today. And I think that's wonderful, especially when you consider and really think about this. Who are the other people that you know should have been in this room, but who aren't here? But you're here. And so you really are to be applauded for that, because for some people, the people who weren't here, just having to think about this, just having to sit in a room and hear people talk about this was so painful they couldn't do it. And what I always say is, if you think it's painful for you, imagine how it feels for some of those who we're not thinking about it. We're worried about dodging bullets, okay? Just listening to it is the easy part, okay? So there are lots of things that can be done, and I applaud everyone for what they've said. I am one of those people who has dedicated my life to this. I have been doing anti-racism training for 30 years, and I've done it, you know, I always say everywhere from Uzbekistan to Santa Fe, and for 30 years. And I only work with organizations or groups of people who are interested in doing it, and I do it in a number of ways, either through workshops or teaching circles or whatever it is. If you have a group that wants to talk about it, that wants to do something, that wants to do experiential exercises, let me know. That's what I do. As I said, I have dedicated my life to this for the last 30, actually longer than that, because I started doing it when I was in high school. And will continue to do it until the day I die. So there are a number of things, and I always say to people, there never is just one way of doing it. There's 100 million ways of doing it. Just talking to people, or showing up at places, or you know, signing petitions, or writing letters, all of that helps. And don't ever let anybody make you feel bad because you weren't the person that was standing out on the sidewalk or whatever. Whatever you do helps. Just do something, and then do it again and again and again and again, because that's what it's going to take to break this down.
Thank you. Michael.
I encourage all of you to check out the organization I work for, Santa Fe Youth Works. It's on the website. We're on Cerrillos Road. We have a lot of young people that could benefit from tutoring and all kinds of help, and come and get to know us and the young people. I also want to mention that we're having an event, ironically, at the Lenzig next week. And I'd love for this to be one of those rare events there that has a very diverse crowd, and we're casting a wide net. It's very cheap, it's $12, and it's a man named Father Greg Boyle from Los Angeles. He works for Homeboy Industries, and I think we can learn a lot from him, and I'd like to see some of that work and the work that we do continue to grow. So please come out. We'd love to have you there. Thank you.
What is your event called?
It's called Jobs, Not Jails, an evening with Father Greg Boyle.
He also does Homegirl Cafe.
That's right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Dr. Trujillo, and then you want me to come down here, Ivy? Okay.
I just wanted to add to some of what Kiran was saying. So in addition to reaching out, right, reaching out to Albuquerque, reaching out to other cities, I would also invite us to reach in. I'm a part of a lot of really wonderful organizations, and I'm honored to serve on the board of Tewa Women United and the Northern Rio Grande National Heritage Area. And I'm also working with the Sostenga la Vida Agricultural Institute at Northern New Mexico College. And we've talked a lot about youth today, and youth absolutely so important, but we can't forget to equalize that out in terms of, thinking about our elders. And we're losing a lot of our elders right now. So something that we can do is that we can speak to our elders and we can hear that traditional knowledge. And a big part of that is we have to understand that in our communities that have been ravaged by colonization and still are being ravaged by colonization, things like the Santa Elena development in the South Valley is colonization, is that indigenous people, collectively, as indigenous people, but as bigger, larger communities, it's also important for us to understand that decolonization is something that we all are a part of. Gloria Anzaldúa that said, if we change ourselves, we change the world. And so it is those small actions that we make. And so it's about recovering, it's about recuperating, it's about decolonizing, and it's about intergenerational work, right? Thinking about the 4 directions, thinking about our newborns, thinking about children, thinking about adults. A lot of times we tend to talk in past and present, right? The kids and the elders, but there's also this present tense of those of us who are sitting in the room, and it's up to us to really support those other groups that are more vulnerable than we are.
Thank you, Dr. Trujillo.
So, I would speak to the white members of this audience that I would encourage you that you can do it. You can use your voice, and you can start living in an anti-racist way. Tanya had talked a little bit about getting uncomfortable, and my skin is still getting thicker, and I don't think it'll ever stop getting thicker, but it needs to be. White culture, it's kind of frowned upon to talk about this stuff, and it's almost considered rude to talk about race. So you're gonna have to practice not being liked. And I'm a people pleaser, but my suggestion is to we've said working from the inside out. So doing the work that you need to do first so that you don't cause people of color to be collateral damage to your learning. And what that means is reading articles and books written by people of color about their experience of being people of color and believing them. Get practice with other white people. talking about, instead of talking to your, unfortunately, one black friend. Or, you guys have probably seen that number, that most white people have less than one, friend of color. And then I also wanted to talk about a little bit, I'm a psychotherapist, and one of the things I do is I do self-care for the Black Lives Matter movement. I run a secret self-care group. And when Tanya talks about getting uncomfortable and how, you can get, white people's feelings can get hurt if it means saving black people's lives or Native people's lives, or, another part of that self-care and that mental health aspect is that they're doing this work 24 hours a day. How tiring. I'm just, right now with, the very publicized murder that's going on, they're seeing, images of black and brown bodies all the time. They're tired. So we need to step up and we need to pick up, because this is, I think this is our problem. And in Santa Fe, we talk a lot about spirituality and awareness, and I went to Southwestern College, and I studied Buddhism like mad, but we had one course that was on, multiculturalism. And my personal belief, so this is kind of a call to you too, is that we can't, as white people, be fully human if we're living with this filter of white privilege between us and the rest of the world. So there's this beautiful opportunity to be real.
Before we thank you, Ivy, you got clap. And so I just want to add, I want to make sure, panelists, because we're going to open it up to questions, but if you want to chime in here on tools or what we can do next, I'm sure you'll have more time to talk, but I just want to make sure that we're all good and that I'm doing my job. Michael, go ahead.
I would just like to say, I think there needs to be more events that appeal to all types of people, and music and coming together, not this is for this group, this is for that group. Like music, that's what I think really is the thing that brings people together. I just think there's not enough in Santa Fe, there's not enough on the south side, there's not venues. We need that. That's how we heal.
And food.
And so just to throw my voice into the conversation and then give it to you, even though there was a question here on white fragility, I think Ivy took care of that. So that one's done. Check that off. But this idea that if you don't talk about something, it's going to get better, right? And so a lot of the research that I'm really interested in is how we talk about violence as a disease. And there's some work that's happening in Albuquerque right now around our police department, and really saying that, it's easy to fire a chief. It's easy to let Christian Englander go away and not have to do the systemic work that cultures of training and education indoctrinate us with, right? But this idea that it is a disease, meaning like alcoholism. Yes, genetically you might be predisposed to it, but it actually takes action for you to engage in alcoholism. Like you have to go have a drink, right? And so if we talk about the undoing of alcoholism, whether it's genetic or whether it's behavioral, I think it's both, right? It's behavioral, but if you have it in your family, you're genetically more predisposed to alcoholism. Then the first thing, everybody who's been to AA or been there with a loved one knows that the first step is acknowledging you have a problem. So the idea that it's going to go away without talking about it, is scientifically horseshit, right? That's what AA has taught us, right? And if you don't believe it, because I feel like this room probably leans left here tonight, I say, then think about people on one side of the abstinence-only argument. You really think if you don't talk to your children about sex that they're not going to learn about it somewhere else? Then maybe you should talk to them about it if you want them to have certain values about it. Same way about race. Colorblind won't help them. It will hurt them, actually. And then someone else will teach them their values about race. That example's not good enough. I'm a poet, I got 100. So the other one is the climate change argument. Yeah, you can not talk about it if you want. But if the floods keep coming and the water keep rising, guess what? You will be in a boat still denying climate change. So pretending it doesn't exist is that's not going to work, right? That's not going to work. So being here and having the conversation is critically important. So I'm going to go back to the panel. Round of applause for the panel, right?
started, I would just like to say one thing to, again, piggyback on what Hakeem has said. It is so very, very, very important that we start talking to our children about this, talk to them early, talk to them often. Scientists have taught us that the values that a child has at age 7 are the values they will keep for the rest of their life.
So I just want to jump in with, so we're going to start with whiteness. So you guys get to be the front of the line again. Sorry. You guys can kick me out. I go back to Albuquerque later tonight. So this is a number of questions. I'm going to do my best to synthesize, so I'm sorry if I do your questions a disservice. But talk panel a little bit about what can like those moderate whites do to help the movement, just like in election, in electioneering, we know that the people who are on the right are going to be on the right, people on the left are going to be on the left. So all the campaigning, all those billions of dollars that need to get out of our election system, all go towards the voters in the middle. They all go towards the swing states. And so what can they do to kind of to be part of the solution? I'm going in and out. And I'm give you a two-part question. How much of that is actually how much of that is actually malicious malice, malicious racism, and how much of that is just ignorance, or are they the same thing? Jump in.
Maybe you should repeat the question.
Just what can moderate whites do, and is it a difference between not knowing, or is it or just like not doing or intentionally doing harm?
Can I just say a few words on that one? So when I was doing my studies at University of New Mexico, my advisor was a guy called Ricky Leannan, and he teaches whiteness studies, right? So he helps people, his critical whiteness studies helps people unpack what it means to be a part of the white collective, and how a lot of the times where, white people can think that they're individuals, and most of the time they think they're not part of what's going on. And so when white people try to have solutions about what to do, they go back to the individualism. Don't try to do things all by yourself, right? So one of the key things that critical whiteness studies teaches you is get involved in critical whiteness studies groups, white groups, where white people can discuss what it means to go through the guilt, the shame, the anger that goes with learning about being part of the white collective, right? And so being in those groups and circles and trying to figure out how to, and this is where Ivy's work is essential as well, right? There's a lot of psychosocial work that needs to be done by white people and all people actually. And there's great educators like Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's a black psychologist who works on identity development, right? So this collective of ours in different forms, like for me it's Asian, what does it mean and what is my role in the racial hierarchy, right? We have to know our positionality and how we are oppressor-oppressed in different ways, right? So that positionality helps us know what our role is in a day-to-day way. And so in those groups, you could start taking action. And white people, the thing that comes about from, going through critical whiteness studies, I learned that you get to hear what's really going on in the psyche of a lot of other white people that think that they can say things in front of you, right? The well-meaning white people get to hear all sorts of stuff, right? Start collecting some of those stories, right? Put them together so that the world can know how bad things really are, right? You have an insight into what is going on in our country in a way that sometimes we're oblivious to, because we don't know that it's sitting in so many people's minds and hearts and heads. And so you can be white allies in the mix in that way. Help us know what's going on. But definitely one of our African American community partners in the work I do in community engagement lets us know that it's for people of color to be in the driver's seat, and for white people to ride along, right? So it's best to sort of work with people of color and groups of color to try and know what to do next, right? So be connected to groups of color, people of color, organizations that are movement building. So just those two things.
Any other panelists want to jump in? Yes, Dr. Trujillo.
I really appreciate what you were just saying, because it's about that sense of not only, a lot of times people of color are called on to be the content for events, right? Come and bring your wonderful music, come and bring your beautiful dance, but many times we're not invited to be the architects of a lot of different kinds of movements, of a lot of different kinds of organizations or events. And so what happens a lot of times too is that well-meaning white folks, white allies even, will reach out and ask, in my experience, women of color, oh, we're having this big, wonderful conference, can you come? And you're in charge of everything people of color, right? And so there's this sensibility that their work was the outreach, when in fact it actually puts the woman of color in a very precarious situation. And the other thing that happens is that's tied to professional positions. We're called in to add content, but when we say professional position, decision maker, what we're also saying is salary maker. And so a lot of times we're called on to support people who are in positions of power, and our work becomes invisible and uncompensated, and that's inappropriate as well.
And I would add to that we're not even so much sometimes called in to add content, we're called in to add color. Our job is to make the corporation photo look really, really good. But we don't get to sit at the boardroom. We don't get to make the decisions. We don't get to do any of those type of things, because that again involves white people letting go of some of the power. And that's really hard for an awful lot of people. What tends to happen very, very often, although an awful lot of well-meaning white people will not admit it, what happens is that right now in our society, because we do have very much a dominant culture, non-dominant culture society, is we have the dominant culture up here and the non-dominant culture down here. And when we say let the people in, we're meaning this. But what white people think is you're meaning this. And that's scary. And it's frightening. And we don't know where that goes or what it looks like or how to do it. One of the things that I do when I teach my workshops is I do an entire section on primarily teaching white people what it looks like and feels like to be an ally, a true ally. Because most people don't have any idea.
Did you want to, Karen? Yes.
This was said a little bit earlier in regards to talking with your kids about this. I think it's really important that young folks have strong role models, especially young folks that are white, and having solid white ally adult role models. There was a school here, their youth were putting on a game of capture the flag at the dog park a few years ago, and it was themed as cowboys and Indians. And when this was brought up to them and to the school, the adults of the school defended the students because they were trying to do something outdoors and got over 150 youth involved in playing cowboys and Indians up at the dog park. So these things are problematic, and when the adults don't respond appropriately, it just perpetuates it, because what's the problem with us wearing headdresses and running around the park and shooting each other? There's a big problem with that. Places that I would refer you to get your youth involved are things like the New Mexico Gay Straight Alliance Network, which is out of the Santa Fe Mountain Center. They have an incredible camp called Activist Camp in the fall. Youth Allies for Sustainability at Earth Care is another great place for these safe conversations with young folks to happen, not only for white youth, to be honest with you. A lot of the focus is also on undoing internalized racism, which is huge. Caucusing with youth, and also checking your own privilege and making sure that you're ready to have these conversations with young people.
I'm going to throw another question in, but feel free to answer if you want to. You can answer previous questions, okay? The rules of the panel. So we talked a little bit about this, but let's go a little deeper on this. We talked about Fiestas. I also hear from the audience that Zozobra is celebrating the killing of Native Americans as well, but that brings a lot of money to Santa Fe, so figure that out if you're going to actually change that. That the U.S. is a settler colonist country, right? And so what is the legacy of colonialism? But I really like the last question, and this is for anyone, especially up here who identifies as indigenous. What is any one of you from up there, including me, bringing to this area different than what any other colonizer has brought? Did somebody break the panel? Somebody broke the internet. Somebody broke the internet.
Somebody talk about that Zozobra part of that comment? I'd like to make a comment about that. That's actually not where Zozobra came from. Zozobra is actually from a burning of a white landowner who was very cruel to his Native and Hispanic help, and they didn't feel like they had any power, so they built an image of him and they burnt him in effigy, and it became a tradition. That's what I heard. I'm from here. I've been from here all my life. I was born here all my life.
Let's give it to the panel. What do you think, panel?
I can somewhat address that. First, I would point everybody in the direction of a wonderful film. It's called Gathering Up Again, and it's by Diane Reina from Taos Pueblo. She does a really wonderful job of unpacking, first of all, the tricultural mythology, but she really does talk about the tensions of the fiestas, right? It's about that same thing I was talking about earlier, continuous, discontinuous, and emerging communities all existing in one place at one time. And I don't want to discount your story because I believe in the power of stories. So I find what you said very compelling and interesting, and I would love to follow up on it. But I know that in terms of Zozobra, it was something that was brought into the Santa Fe Fiestas by Will Schuster in 1926, from what I remember. And what Will Schuster, who was one of the Cinco Pintores, right, also appropriation of language in terms of who the Cinco Pintores were. They were all white men from the East Coast, but people really like to take that mantle of identity and culture when they come to New Mexico. And so he thought that the traditional fiestas were too solemn, that the traditional fiestas were actually very religious in their observance, and so there wasn't the merriment that we necessarily consider associated with them. And so he had gone to Mexico, and he had seen a burning of an effigy there and seen the whole community come around that. And so he introduced Zozobra actually as something that happened in his backyard initially, and then it grew in popularity, and it was a way when we talk about when cultures come into contact with each other, is that there is that change, right? There is the sensibility that we inform each other, that we riff off of each other. You know, think about hip hop, like the sense of sampling music and then putting it into a contemporary context. We riff off of each other all the time. And so what's interesting for me, and this is part of my own work that and what I do, is I actually read Zozobra really differently. There are very few times in the year when Hispanos and Native people can recuperate space. I really believe that Zozobra is one of them. When you go to that audience, right, and you see who's partying there, what music is being represented, it's been shifting more recently. But and this is going to sound incendiary, Zozobra. But I really read Zozobra as burning whiteness, not individual white people, but burning whiteness in effigy and a reclamation of the space of Santa Fe for the people who were traditional and indigenous peoples of this area.
Carol, I want to start off with the last question. What is it that we think? Say that again.
So it's about what are we bringing to the conversation that no other colonizer or non-indigenous person has brought to this conversation?
Well, the only answer I can give to that one is I have no idea. You have to decide. You have to listen to what I said, and you decide. Perhaps nothing, perhaps something of value. I hope so. I'm trying, but that's the best answer I can give to that one. I don't know the history of Zozobra and won't pretend to. I know usually these arguments boil down to cultural pride. Let's take, for instance, where I'm from, the Confederate flag, Martin Luther King Day. I remember there was one southern state, when they finally passed Martin Luther King Day, they made it the same day as Confederate Memorial Day. That is an absolute fact. So that you could then decide which holiday you were celebrating. I think it was Mississippi. But that's what they boil down to. and achieving some sort of feeling of equality. And there's always that behind them. That doesn't resolve them, but I just say that's what they're about at rock bottom. The only other thing I would add is that it's difficult in Santa Fe because a lot of people come to Santa Fe to get away from sociopolitics. It's true. Well, except for the people who were born here. See, that's the contradiction. But a lot of the people who come here, the colonizer, and this includes African Americans actually, many who I talked to, they've experienced being they've experienced being judged not by who they are, but by their color or race. And they see this as where they get away from that. They come here to get away from that. Now, what they're not seeing is that's built on other people who live here, who are part of a socioeconomic dynamic and can't get away from that. And what they're not seeing is that's not real transcendence, that's denial. I mean, real transcendence is somehow resolving both those things, coming to a place and respecting what's here, and also liberating those other people who belong to very specific socioeconomic classes, most blatantly poverty, liberating them out of it. So that's the best I can do. But as far as, what I bring, that's a challenging question. Possibly nothing. You decide. You tell me. I'm only trying to bring something to the table.
Before Corinne jumps in, thank you. Before Corinne jumps in, in acknowledging a part of the African American history here that Tanya spoke of being here, since the 1400s, coming with the Spanish and coming up from Mexico. We can't forget about the African presence in Mexico too, in that this was that first, but or after colonization. The first empire, right? The Mexican Empire, before the current empire, but the idea that also there was an influx of oppression by black folk. And there's a question in here that maybe we get to, maybe we don't, about what do you mean? One of the panelists talked about what do you mean that systemic racism is perpetuated by institutions? I mean, the United States government sent African Americans out here as Buffalo Soldiers, as you know, to oppress other brown people. So that's what we mean when institutions help perpetuate racism. So then they pit us against each other. So they didn't really have a choice. They were offered money or land or an escape from the very racist South, and they came and they brought the oppression of the institution.
Absolutely. I think that sort of gets to what Darrell was saying about how, what we bring is what we bring from a counter storytelling perspective, right? So most of what we all receive, and that includes all of us, through the education systems we've been in, through the media we've been exposed to, everything comes from a certain lens, right? We've had to do a lot of work to try and undo some of that socializing that has been done to us. And so what we bring, hopefully, is some counter-narratives, counter-stories, and they're sitting in the audience too. I'm sure there's a lot that you can also bring that other colonizers haven't. Colonizers bring a certain version of history and ways of reality, right? And what a lot of the panelists have been bringing is that counter-story. So I would recommend any of that alternative lens, that epistemology that helps us see things from a different perspective is needed. And so whether you read it or speak to others or learn from history to try and undo the colonized minds that we all have, right?
Before you, Tanya, I had Ivy and then...
Oh, okay, go ahead.
To the colonizer question, I would say that I'm pretty fully colonizer, and that I use that a lot to see the broader picture. So when a thought comes into my mind, I think, oh, you know what? Other white people and the white systems are thinking that thought. So we have that as a tool that we can use to help bring down that system, that it is internalized so much. And then the other thing that I was going to say was I wanted to repeat what Patricia said about setting whiteness on fire and not individual white people. This is a huge barrier to understanding. People of color they're looking past you as an individual to this big problem. They're seeing the forest and you're kind of a tree. So they're they're not saying all white people. There's even a hashtag, not all white people, because so much of the time they say something about their, what's going on and what's wrong, and we say, well, not all white people. So starting to see that.
And also being able to say that's true for the other, right? So just like,
Black people
we want our police departments to understand that we're not all criminals, not all black people, right? And so how does that affect your behavior? It works both ways. So.
And I wanted to quickly say a couple of things. First of all, one of the great youth groups that hasn't been mentioned yet is a group called Generation Justice that does some absolutely wonderful work throughout northern New Mexico. And as for the question of what do we bring, I think also we need to not get into the mindset that everybody that comes somewhere brings something evil. I mean, yes, we certainly all have brought some things that are not nice, but it doesn't have to be that way. One of the things that I feel like that hopefully I bring and others do is I bring an openness. I bring an appreciation for the people who are already here and what what they have brought, what they are about. I also bring my own personal story as something that I have to share in exchange for you sharing yours with me.
Something you said made me think of a story I think is relevant here. Questions are being asked of us, okay? Let me say two things. A dear friend of mine, his name is Paul Jacobs, a very talented musician. When I was invited to be on this panel, I spoke to him just coincidentally. And who here remembers Meatloaf, the band Meatloaf? Who here remembers Sesame Street? Okay. Well, Paul has written music for both, okay, him and his wife, and National Lampoon. Very, very talented cat. He told me he was in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago, and whatever it was, he was running. He had forgotten something, and he was running. And he's a fairly tall guy, and he was running very aggressively to get to where he needed to go. And he said that he thought to himself, if I was black, they would, the cops would have me on the ground immediately. Now, Paul is Jewish. He's a white man from Queens. Fairly unthreatening looking guy. But he knows that would have happened to him. He's very confident that would have happened to him. He's not black, but he's aware of the realities. Now, my question to you guys is, who would agree with his assertion? Raise your hand. Okay? Who here knows anything that can be done to change that? Okay? So you're the people that need to be heard from. Because everyone else then is part of the problem. Think about it.
And just to piggyback off what Brian said, and this is for the organizers, is that maybe in future renditions of this conversation, letting the panelists ask the audience questions, right? And I think it was something that was spoken to earlier by Ivy, is that oftentimes as people of color, we had this conversation in organizing this. There was lots of back and forth, like who's the most effective messenger? So I could talk about racism till I'm black in the face, but and he's another paranoid black man, right? So they need to hear it from Dr. Ricky Lee Allen. They need to hear it from Tim Wise and let Tim make a little bit of money, right? When they can hear it from each other, right? Just with a little bit of courage and way less money, you can hear it from each other, right? And so who's the most effective messenger? Our panel does have a significant representation of people of color, and so the flip side of that coin is it our job to educate all of our white friends? Like, I have way more than 0.10% white friends. I have lots of white friends. I live in New Mexico, right? I want to have friends, period, and I want to have more than 2. Some of them are going to be white, right? You know what I'm saying? So that's my reality, right? And so what is the inverse of that? Do I always have to feel responsible for educating people on my lived experience? I don't know, but to Brian's point is that the answers have to come from out there. They absolutely have to come from out there. Yes?
I'd like to pose one more question. What's the upside for anyone, if everyone in the audience that's white, identifies themselves as white, what's the upside for you changing things the way we think they need to be changed? You know, well, see, she says she doesn't know.
No, I didn't say I don't know. I meant it's obvious.
Okay, that's obvious, because that looks like okay, she's saying that's obvious. Okay, so what is the upside? What is the upside? If you give a damn about anything other than yourselves, the upside is, oh, where's that little girl that was over there? There's a little girl. The upside are the kids that are coming. That's right. Because not many people I know are going to give up what they have to give it to someone else, because that's how it's presented very often from the other side, seemingly. It seems to be presented. Who's going to do that? I travel the world, okay? I'm not bragging, I'm lucky. But I know that the American lifestyle that we all share has its foot on some other people's neck. So part of the reason, maybe, for those that consider themselves very spiritual, whatever that means to people, okay? Maybe the reason you can't climb up that damn ladder is because the ladder is going to burn. Because there are people that can't wait to see this shit come down. Now, if we don't correct it amongst ourselves, we don't have the position to get away with half the shit we're getting away with. We have the power. You know, a famous politician said, "Politics is what's going to change things." And they're right. Military will only buy you time. Politics just means policy. It's a bad word because of what our politicians do, but it's a derivative of policy. Okay, if you don't see an upside, okay, for the change that we're speaking of. If you don't see an upside, you're part of the problem, and it's okay, because you're always going to be there. The yous are always going to be there. The us's are always going to be there, black and white. Because some of the most racist people I know happen to be black. It's just, they're just not in positions of power, so it doesn't matter. Okay? Some. And I'm not saying the most racist person is black. Some of them. But my point is, we are part of a system that is fucking this world up. Okay? We do some good, but we're doing a lot of damage. I don't know that I really want to be running it. So what are we going to do to change it so it is something better? It starts from the inside. Because when this burns down, we're burning together, if it burns.
And let me just give you a quick example, something that happened to me that I feel like was just the most telling example. I was doing an anti-racism workshop, which incidentally was in Santa Fe. And at the break, two white women came up to talk to me, and one said, you know, I'm not sure I'm getting this. And I said, well, you know, tell me, what do you mean by that? And she said, I don't understand. Tell me what I'm supposed to think. And then said, and tell me what I'm supposed to feel about all of this. And yeah, that's what I thought. Oh my God. Talk about having to do somebody else's work for them. And I thought, you know, how can I really break this down into the most concrete thing that I can do? I said, suppose you woke up tomorrow morning and all of the people of color had disappeared. And when I said that, the one white woman instantly burst into tears. And the other one said, I don't get it. And I said, you know what? Then you never will.
So I want to do a temperature check. So I didn't get through all the questions. Blame me, don't blame the panel. We said we're going to be done around 8:30. It's 8:15. But I know that I work in classrooms a lot, And I know when I start to see that glazed over look in my students, that I should quit, right? That they've kind of had enough. So where are you guys at? Had enough? Yeah. Stand up and move. You feel free to stand up and move where you're at. Feel free to know that if you need to go, as long as you've signed in, I'm gonna make this announcement now, that we've got your email address to inform you about future conversations. Interact with the group via the Facebook page. You can recommend speakers. You can ask questions that didn't get asked tonight, and we'll do our best to field them. But I'm gonna ask one more question, throw it to the panel, and then panel, just know that at like 8:29, I'm gonna give you this signal, and we're gonna be done so we can honor people's time and let the staff at Warehouse 21 go. So the question I've had in my hand for a couple of minutes, because your answers have been so juicy, kind of go to, some of it is about youth. Our youth need help, because no matter what their appearance, as in my younger daughter, will always be categorized as how she looks, and we spoke a little bit about that earlier at that end of the table. Then that kind of dovetails into when we acknowledge other people in Santa Fe, and they're brown people. This happens in Albuquerque too. And you know, if they're Vietnamese, we call them Chinese. And if they're African American, we call them Nigerian. And so what is that little blind spot, if you will, quote unquote? And I guess that dovetails into the kind of being stopped or walking while colored, specifically with the immigrant experience. So talk a little bit about color and the immigrant experience, and for those of you who do youth work, how that connects to our young people.
In the United States, this is a country that was built on racism from its very instance. And so in the United States, your face is your race. Always has been, hopefully maybe one day that'll change. But that's how you do, how the society does. And as a group of people, we are tremendously lazy. And so what lazy people